Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to be interrupted by Thelonious Monk and company. My name is Eirik Steinhoff. I'm adjunct faculty at Evergreen, and I'm delighted to welcome everybody to the final art lecture of the spring quarter and of the school year. It's been a very long year, and it's remarkable to imagine that we're actually here at the end of it. Today we've got a wonderful event with Evergreen's own literary arts faculty, Miranda Mellis. I will say a few words at the outset here. Miranda will be introduced by Evergreen literary arts alum, Sophia Mclean, and then we'll have the reading. There will be a Q&A starting around 1 o'clock or after Miranda's gone for about an hour. And I'll talk more about that process as we go along. I will draw your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen there, and you are welcome to type in a question as the event proceeds, and we'll be able to circle back to as many of those questions as possible. So I wanted to start the day with an acknowledgement of the land on which the Evergreen State College is located. This land, this territory, was dispossessed or stolen from Indigenous people. Those of us who reside in the southernmost reach of the Salish Sea are living on the ancestral lands of the Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes, which include the Squaxin Island tribe, the Nisqually Indian tribe, and the Puyallup tribe of Indians. The 1854 treaty ceding these lands has been the subject of incredible struggle and resistance, and also of unprecedented transformation. These treaty tribes all still reside in this area and are actively engaged with the land and with their communities. All who are not Indigenous are visitors here. We recognize the traditional custodians of these lands and pay respect to elders past and present. We celebrate Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and acknowledge that there is much work to be done in this respect. So the art lecture series has been running for about 10 years now, thanks to the incredible energy and focus of our colleague, Shaw Osha. Shaw has been on leave this quarter, but I wanted to acknowledge the incredible work that Shaw has done to invent and maintain this series. There's many hands that go into this work. Julie Ron has been a really important supporter from the kind of administrative side of things. And then Raul Berman and the team of media services interns and employees have actually made this work possible. And so immense gratitude to those contributors as well. There's more information about the art lectures in the link that I just dropped into the chat. And I also wanted to share one other announcement. We'll come back to this one at the end of our session today, but this afternoon, we've got quite a bit to look forward to. At 1:30, the Path Parties start. You can read more about the Path Parties at this website. It's a chance for you to connect with faculty in different areas of study at Evergreen. And then the academic fair, of course, is at 4 p.m. So you can find more information about that in the link that I've added in the chat there. So I'll pause there, say welcome once again to the 90 participants who are here. I expect more people will join us as we go along. And with that, I'll turn things over to one of Evergreen's illustrious literary arts alum, Sophia Mclean.
Thank you so much, Eirik. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia, and I am so honored to be introducing Miranda. Today, we get to celebrate the forthcoming release of Miranda's new book, Demystifications, which is out June 1st from Solid Objects. Miranda is also the author of The Spokes, The Quarry, None of This Is Real, The Revisionist, Materialisms, and The Instead with Emily Abendroth. She co-edited the Encyclopedia Project, and she is currently working on a novel called Two Problems in Three Parts. You can find her seasonal column, The Trinocular, online at the Believer Logger. and Miranda has taught at Evergreen since 2012. As a way of introducing Miranda's writing to you, I'm going to read her response to a series of questions Emily Abendroth asked during their correspondence for the Instead. The questions were about the distinctions of genre, as Miranda works in many genres, and her writing is experimental and formally inventive. Miranda answers, I'm interested in any form of writing that can keep a question or subject in process, moving, open, on trial, as Julia Kristeva puts it. Fiction and fable are especially suited for hypothesis without resolution. I turn most to fiction and literature-inflected philosophy for the pleasures of knots and paradoxes, and for modes of inquiry that move between empiricism and chaos, analysis and speculation, the intricately patterned, the contingent, the precise, and the directly revelatory. It is these ways of knowing that enthrall me as a reader of Miranda's work. These stories do not resolve, but they do not end in the same place they began. Perhaps they end alongside it, a parable, a parabola, arriving back after a journey. Other shapes that come to mind are a spiral or a vortex, to borrow from Fanny Howe and Giorgio Agamben, respectively. They contain logics that I recognize in uncanny ways. I find myself disoriented by location, by time. The past, future, and present are tangled, living together as they do in our bodies. These disorientations make different engagements possible. They place the reader or the character right in the crucial imaginary space where they can begin to detect what is wrong and what is possible. Miranda writes about parables in an earlier section of the Instead. We can look into the inner logic of social processes and see intertwining systems. Parables are compressed, distilled versions of complex logics that imaginatively counsel us as to their effects. Parables, or parabola, or parole meaning words. That is to say, the lessons, the stakes are in the language. When Agamben writes about parables in The Fire and the Tale, he writes in reference to the parables of the Bible. The word was given to us as parable, not to distance us from things, but to keep them close, even closer, as when we recognize a similarity in a face, as when a hand touches us lightly. Imaginative counsel is, I think, a compelling way to describe Miranda's work. Imagination being something that runs through all our instruments of knowing, that includes the sensorium, that which is communal between bodies and awakens them. She helps us think our way into the beings of others, to being with others, including and especially non-humans. This imaginative counsel in the form of writing is an incredible enrichment for all our social, political, artistic expressions. A friend of mine once remarked that Miranda makes good groups, and I heartily agree. I think what that means is a key part of her teaching is helping students be with each other generously. I had the good fortune of being invited to a panel among other former students of Miranda's so that we could talk to her current students in the literary arts capstone about our MFA journeys. Claire Elliott, my fellow panelist, talked about the etymology of the word cohort, which shares a root with horticulture. I recognized us as a kind of cohort that day, us being Miranda's former, current, future students. We are not so much in conversation through shared time and space. Actually, as I rather keenly felt through the virtual meeting room, we are anything but in shared time. We are anything but in shared physical space, although this would have been nearly impossible even in non-pandemic times. But we have a different kind of foundation, something more like plants having grown in the same soil. It was super nourishing to talk to each other about writing through our shared foundation of knowing what it was to be a writer with other writers in the way Miranda cultivates, even though some of us had never met before this event. In light of that conversation, I have been thinking about the way trees in the same forest know each other, even at great distances, sharing carbon with each other and communicating through mycelium networks. I feel incredibly lucky to be a sapling in this forest with all of you who also feel the necessity of shared engagement and pleasurable mutual responsibility to each other. Thank you, Miranda, for this teaching. And now let's welcome Miranda Mellis.
Thank you so much, Sophia. That was a really beautiful, eloquent, and elegant introduction. I'm very honored. And speaking of forests, I'm going to begin my reading by reading from a work in progress that Sophia mentioned, 2 problems in 3 parts. And then I'll read from this new book, Demystifications, and I'll close with reading an excerpt from the Instead, which Sophia also mentioned, which is a book-length correspondence with the poet Emily Abendroth. And I'll read an excerpt that I understand some students have read this week. And then at 12:30, we can have a conversation. So this is from 2 problems in 3 parts. Inhaling the scent of rain pounding, I fall asleep on the couch with the window open, and I sleep many hours, as is my wont these days, regardless day or night, left to my own devices. I dreamed the house was sliding into a ravine and woke in a torpor to find myself sliding off the couch and the sky darkened by downpour. I went outside to observe the wide rivulets that puncture the ground, numberless tiny waterfalls sweeping the soil downhill, particle by particle. The land is deluged, becomes a slippery clay. There's no denying the house is sliding too. It presents itself eternally, full for me with memory, but now I see its future and mine falling over the edge. And as every object is thrown from its customary place, tools, appliances, clothes, chairs, dishes, art, books, tables, windows, crashing, breaking, flying, decontextualized and strewn, scattered, trashed, undone, will these objects not find their tentative disbelief and mystifying way of floating non-committally 1 inch in the air justified? Is there anything that is not unsettled? Perhaps the wet hand that is digging away under the house has designs more important than mine, as I have never known where things should be anyway, and have always sensed a vast disorder very near. And when finally the downturn comes and all is lost, what remains is that which had been displaced by the illusion of order. In ancient Mesopotamia, houses were stacked like clay dishes on terraced hillsides, continuously built up, generation after generation, under every age, other ages. My house, on a ridge, its legs hidden in the earth, feels itself slipping, the sinking house that once buoyed me up, now weighs me down. It wants to slide to elide me. When the land is logged and stripped, monocropped, extracted, root systems that held the soil in place, once held in a strong weave, are deconstructed, the soil grows flighty and it runs away. Root systems take weight, give all its meaning to the word, the concept weight, for earth is gravity itself, is grave, so why hate death or growing down? Mountains are risen weight, seas are bowls of weight bearing weight, tsunamis break new lines between the land and the sea. Mountains break open and the land slides down. A mountain buries itself. A house is a habitable hill. I ask the house what to do. It says, go ask the rain. It isn't me, but water that goes wherever it wants. We contemporaries inherit the aesthetics of the fragment, everyone born after the atom bomb, after Oppenheimer et al., and after the 20th century's dying empires fantasized into being a cut-up world of lines in the sand, lines through lands as if history began with them. Around here, it's very clear cut. The mountains are sliding because of logging, because of the 19th century settler colonial cult of the clear cut. For those of us who come after, we begin at the end. War and its art forms are our tradition. The wars move around, sometimes distant, sometimes near, sometimes right here. We inherit war as series, as chapter book, as season, World War I, World War II. As such, war became our horizon. Mayakovsky wrote that a change of plane from that in which an action or fact is situated. A certain distance is indispensable. You have to stand back at a distance equal to 3 times the size of the object. If you don't do that, you simply won't see the thing you're depicting. The bigger the thing or the event, the further you have to get away from it. This is a scientific attitude from a Bolshevik who killed himself instead of killing Stalin. My mother would recommend being objective about the house sliding into the ravine. Because it's objective, she would say, you can solve it. I agree, but not objectively. Sometimes sitting at the bottom of the ravine, which threatens to change the plane of my house, I feel a change of plane stealing over my spirit, a careless happiness, and I don't mind what happens. A silent comedy laughs through me. The erosion of the ravine mirrors the slow decay of my own sensibilities and hopes. A cedar branch leans over me like a concerned friend. We wish our disasters were small, on the scale of a broken dish, say, but we live on a planet where continents break and drift. After a storm, a big leaf maple exploded. 3 enormous moss-covered limbs crashed down, bringing more light to the hill. The human idea of repair doesn't apply. For trees, death is not a conclusion, but a coming and a going. Though less flamboyant than a living tree with its chatty little leaves eager for light, the dead tree has more living tissue in it. The snag becomes the favorite armature of eagles. Imperceptible myriads feast on dead trees, proliferating so much that seemingly dead trees are ever more densely packed with living cells. Sacrificial tree. Ancient cultures felt that sacrificing kings turned the seasons. There was prescience in this idea. Entering the mind of soil, the fact of death is the price you pay, the cost of admission, the ticket to having lived. We are in their company, the ancients. We are their people being mortal. We're in their company and that of dogs, bats, and butterflies who never did dwell in an animal kingdom, who are also buried in green capes of moss and lichen, folded into a flowering underworld of bones, memories, species, debris, becoming insects, rocks, fossils. One pocket of soil has millions of organisms. Where we do not see them, there are the animalcules repairing invisibly in opaque boiling vents of the world garden. The cow can't digest grass or the termite lignin without their bacterial communities to do it for them. Nothing living is not symbiotic, emergent, wave after wave of symbionts, fold after fold, plying each other over millennia. Retrospectively, from afar, our plots look planned, formal, and static, inevitable, explicatable, to explicate from ply. Close up are so many uncertain actions, indecisive horizons, chaotic with upturned plans. Beams of light find ways around the woods, make the forest into a jewel box, an emerald city, shimmying sun, lancing. Birds call percussively. Light is quiet, it spreads, then withdraws. The patterns of alternation, dark leaves where the sun is indirect, lighter where it is a bejeweling. All forms are linked. A fist is like a muscled bend in a hillside. All moments are linked. A tightness in the bone-grown brittle is like a branch on its way to becoming a stick. Everything aging together all at once. What is the nature of that which refuses time? A microwave on its side by a swamp, or a gun in a river with the bones of a flying squirrel? There is a cemetery at the bottom of the ravine. No one has been buried there for a generation. It's just part of the unsanctimonious land, the microbial earth. I walk up and down, traverse the ravine to see if it can tell me how to prevent the house from sliding right off its foundation onto the cemetery, which is to be avoided for obvious reasons, as well as one reason which isn't obvious. Most reasons aren't obvious. The obvious is rarely truly obvious. Even the uncanny equations that show our universe has the properties of a hologram are spoken of in the non-mood of obviousness, but the closer you look, nothing is. Take the sea in our bodies, our scapula like the wings of seabirds, our backs fluid and bony, just like a rocky creek along which time has braided a spine. That things are not obvious is obvious. Even the obvious reason that one should prevent a house sliding into a ravine, isn't it? Why shouldn't it slide into a ravine? The non-obvious reason is the cemetery. And if it is obvious to say a house shouldn't slide off its foundations into a ravine, it's even more obvious to say a house shouldn't fall into a cemetery. As convenient as that might be for me, should I happen to be in the house at that moment, getting me right to the point. No one visits these graves garlanded with rusty metal pendants. Desiccated bouquets dissolve on touch, left for people whose descendants don't know about them, not even of their non-existence. We hang a curtain on this side of that abyss. We wrap ourselves in that love which arises as a balm for dying. Photographs once sealed onto headstones, now effaced, ambiguously swirling. To be forgotten, to be unknown is to be as abstract as a whirl of grain. Out there is the unknown, what we are waiting for, just as we wait for the unknown to announce itself. We wait for the dead to return or to be returned to them. Fabric is the metaphor for space-time, a beautiful, black, infinite fabric stretching on forever, weighed down in places by planets and other cosmic entities their mass attracts. Space covers everything like a vast coat of a piece with all its parts, however different. Space makes them one. Its sleeves are black holes, its buttons are planets. I put on a coat of space, and there is no need to make sense of things or put things in order or prevent them from doing any of the things that objects in space may take it upon themselves to do. So that's the first section of the first part of two problems in three parts, which those three parts are sort of separated as defined as three different kind of genres. So that first piece is in verse, and the second piece is in essay, and the third part is fiction. So I'm going to read now from Demystifications, which is this book that's coming out next week or so. And I wanted to mention that at the back of this book, there is a wonderful index that was created by a greener named Katie Aymar. I was thinking that there might be more text in the index than there is in the book. I'm not sure, but it's really beautiful. And Katie was a literary arts student who went on to work as an archivist and is doing various things. But anyway, she created this really poetic, beautiful index, which lives in a pocket at the back of the book. Demystifications. Getting up early is the cause of a long day. 2. She didn't know what was about to be said. She had to find out after it came out. She knew what was about to be said. Was she hearing faster? How can you hear in advance? Hearing what hasn't yet been said, hearing what's already been said, all the particles of the personal mind, finally shown to be a crowd of strangers, all diluted thus, dropped into a silent, starless garden. 3. What happened to that giant building? Why is it empty? Its walls, soft and green, it's turned back into a forest. After that, they never could think of architecture without thinking of water. 4. After the landslide, a sheer wall of dirt, flat and punctuated by stones, I refuse to attribute my sudden and unwelcome feelings to anything at all. 5. Ambition rushes up as fuel, happiness depletes it. 6. The trees slide uphill, greenly layered and lineated. Go back to your roots. 7. We can't congratulate you on your success. It's the first time we've heard from you in 2 years. Write with bad news first, then we might be more receptive. 8. Wear a suit. Dressing for politics is not magical thinking. Then it's your fault for wearing ribbons in your hair. On election day, you confused pole with maypole. You'll wear your dunce cap to the voting booth from now on. 9. Economists have not learned that politics is made of language. Natural resources are bones. 10. Epic fail. Novel fail. Aphorism fail. Like when an ant loses control of its mandible and drops the torso of a wasp. 11. Resentment is the dried blood of wounded virtue, the Utah of emotions. 12. Would you like to know my secrets? I don't have any. My secrets are feelings. I have a secret, but I don't know what it is yet. 13. It's hard to think if you're always getting interrupted, if your status is interruptible. Surveillance is nothing new. The child hangs an aspiration on the door, private, do not enter. 14. Remember Virginia Woolf's silvery little fish of thought. It starts to glimmer forth, but abruptly disappears when her protagonist is interrupted by the beetle, enforcing spatial prohibitions on thought. If to wander in solitude subjects you to violence, you've been disinvited from thought, and there is no such thing for you as a republic. 15. Milan Kundera wrote, totalitarian society, especially in its more extreme versions, tends to abolish the boundary between the public and the private. Power, as it grows ever more opaque, requires the lives of its citizens to be entirely transparent. The ideal of life without secrets corresponds to the ideal of the exemplary family. A citizen does not have the right to hide anything at all from the party or the state, just as a child has no right to keep a secret from his father or mother. In their propaganda, totalitarian societies project an idyllic smile. They want to be seen as one big family. 16. Walking on eggshells in a forest. Don't want to wake up the trees or kill them, seeing a bird you've never seen and having a sinking feeling. What if it's the last one? Worrying about nature like holding a sick infant in the newborn intensive care unit. Maybe my love will make a difference. That's not falsifiable. Babies thrive when they're loved. Is nature similar? Am I projecting on nature? Or am I nature? Am I history's ventriloquist or nature's dummy? 17. Who isn't a stranger? The feelings of others are enigmatic and soldiers are young. You killed people. Nobody told me they were real. What if the norm was to send the white bourgeoisie to war? Come on, let's not kill ourselves here. Life's too short. He rubs his elbows. Where can I find a decent cappuccino? 18. Paul Celan wrote, if I were like you, if you were like me, did we not stand under one trade wind? We are strangers. 23. The wall at 24 Divisadero bus stop on Divisadero and Haight used to say, the future is passé. 44. I'll take my small talk dry. 58. Cassie has had an astrological chart done for the credit rating system, which was originated by an abolitionist. Apparently, the credit rating system's Chiron is in Cancer. Her alternative credit rating agency grants you credence by asking, what is your real story? 91. Cognition, the ignited cog. Is all thinking, in part, magical thinking? 97. Biodiversity is a communism of non-equivalence. Jean-Luc Nancy wrote, equality is not that equivalence of individuals of which the idea of democracy makes us think first of all, favoring thus insidiously both mercantile equivalence and the atomization of subjects, each as catastrophic as the other, quite the opposite. Democracy should be thought of starting only from the equality of incommensurables, absolute and irreducible singulars that are not individuals or social groups, but sudden appearances, arrivals and departures, voices, tones, here and now, every instant. To demand equality for tomorrow is first of all to assert it today, and by the same gesture to reject catastrophic equivalence. It is to assert common equality as common incommensurability, a communism of non-equivalence. 98, another idea for a TV show. It's called Office Hours. Every episode, someone different coming to office hours. 99. Fanny Howe wrote, the person actually knows the planet and the cosmos better than she knows her own self. That disappears. Edward Said wrote, regard all experiences as if they were about to disappear. So those are some of the demystifications from that book. Thank you. And I'm going to now just read a little bit first from some remarks by Emily Abendroth to set up my response to her in this segment that I wanted to read from this book, The Instead, which we wrote together over the course of a year and came out in 2016. And it really is just a back and forth. That's the whole book. So Emily writes, she's writing about her decarceration activism and the relationship between fracking and prison construction. I've spent a bunch of time trying to prepare this piece of writing in a distinctly essayistic vein about the overlap between fracking and prisons in Pennsylvania. And for me, the most compelling parts of that essay occur when the terms or descriptive language of certain phenomenon operate as a generative portal for exploring implications and lines of force within, but also beyond, its intended application. Phrases like triggered earthquakes and fugitive emissions and the so-called technically recoverable have become ripe sites of linguistic permission to look at collateral effects and necessary preconditions and hidden cultural and commercial ideologies and historical footprints that are present but under-investigated. It's very easy to contaminate an aquifer in the course of the fracking process with all the chemical propellants and additives it requires and the tendencies of gas to migrate. Very easy. But it's incredibly difficult and extremely costly to decontaminate one. Indeed, it may not even be possible given all the real world obstacles in the form of physical, political, social, and economic factors that inhibit it. To install a hydraulic fracking pad requires first leveling the entire area immediately surrounding it, completely denuding the land of trees and vegetation. The company operators make room not just for the pad itself, but for holding tanks, parking lots, waste ponds, access roads, and more. And when they're done exploiting a particular well site, or when they've drawn all the oil or natural gas from it that is profitable to draw, the general practice is simply to plant grass over the whole steam-rolled ruin and to call it restored. But frequently this restoration replaces a complex forest ecosystem that may have provided home to thousands of species of the plant and animal kingdom with a contaminated field of a single non-native ground cover. The companies involved frequently lease the land rather than buying it outright. And then they strategically give it back. Here you go, they say, enjoy your restoration. Or they don't do that because maybe it was state public land to begin with. And now the state tries to envision what else can we lease this land for? And all too frequently they are inclined to think, what if we build a new prison here right on this toxic grassland that was once a deciduous forest? Which is handy in a way because for prison building, they always level everything in the surroundings for surveillance and security purposes. And here it's been pre-performed for them. And the whole exploitative extractive process occurs over and over in both directions. For instance, in Pennsylvania, many prisons are built on the sites of former coal mining operations, now capped, but unstable and leaking. And these facilities are presently inviting fracking companies to make use of the land, even when and as they're still functioning as operating prisons. So she goes on to talk about this kind of fake restoration process and this kind of use of sod, a single non-native ground cover. And here's my response. The extinction math of a world after it is no longer a world, but an afterworld. The sod is an imaginary solution to a real problem, an imaginary recompense for a real violation. And prison is another false solution, an imaginary recompense to be paid by people who are themselves the recipients of criminal violence. Last night I watched this Kendrick Lamar video that just came out yesterday, All Right. The opening shot is of the Golden Gate Bridge, and the film, poem, song unfolds in and around the Bay Area, interspersing scenes of quotidian wars in miniature, such as domestic violence, with scenes of the violence of policing, interspersed in turn with insurrectionist imagery, the hierarchy overturned. For example, a quick shot of the singer with 3 other young Black men carried in their car by 4 large white cops, one at each wheel, struggling under the weight of it. It evokes the carrying of a coffin as well as the carrying of royalty or celebrants, an ironic tableau of reversal. The song is framed by a poem reflecting on cycles of violence rooted in emotional states of consciousness, resentment, turning into abuse, turning into depression. I remember you were conflicted, misusing your influence. Sometimes I did the same, abusing my power, full of resentment that turned into deep depression. Lamar's lyrics. Among other things, the fight against fracking and prison building is a fight against the sod of propaganda, the dangerous pretenses of false solutions, the misuse of influence. I mentioned the video here in relation to your revelation of the ways in which fracking literally paves the way for the opportunistic proliferation of prisons because of how the video ends. Lamar is standing, almost floating on the top of a streetlight. There is recurring flying, floating imagery throughout the video, imagery of getting through, getting up, above and beyond with dreamlike powers that connect the living and the dead. In this last part, a cop pulls up, gets out of his car and seems to pull out a gun to aim at the singer up on the streetlight with the sky large and blue behind him. But when the camera pans back to him, he isn't aiming with a gun, he's aiming with his fingers. He shoots with his thumb and forefingers, but a real bullet seems to go through the body of Kendrick Lamar and he falls, still singing. A real subjection is born mechanically from a fictitious relation. This is Foucault describing the panoptic psyche, in which the threat of the real takes root first in the imaginary and bounds agency through self-policing, preemptive self-subjection. The idea that a real subjection is born mechanically from a fictitious relation shows us something else, though, about what gets produced by this panoptic. What the cop's fictitious hand as gun scene reveals in showing the fatal outcome of an imaginary shooting is that the racist murders the video references begin in the white panoptic, in that imaginary. They are conditioned by, made possible by, perpetuated by that imaginary. The cop, aiming his finger, projects a generalized hologram upon the particular body in his sights, first with his consciousness, which sees not whom, but what. Where does this optic nerve end and where does it begin? When does imaginary murder begin to become real murder? Drawing on Gregory Bateson, Brian Masumi describes different modes of playing. Playing as pedagogical, dedicated to adaptive functions, is fundamentally in the service of the war of all against all. And then there is play that is not rehearsal, not solely adaptive, playing that overspills instrumentality and opening the door to improvisation and variation has its own purposeless purposiveness. Yet always, Masumi writes, play opens a gap between its own situational force and the functionality of the analogs it plays upon, and loads the gap, so to speak, with the purely expressive value of standing for. This is a precarious maneuver that may fly off the tracks at any moment. Masumi describes play as fundamentally autonomous and non-pragmatic activity. Play and the expressivity to which it dedicates itself constitutes an autonomous domain of life activity, one that is fundamentally insubordinate to the logic of adaptation. Play does not conform to its analog arenas, rather play invents and improvises variations on their forms. In the video, Kendrick Lamar's body is in flight, it is in play. With improvisational prowess, he bridges heaven and earth, and we are seeing something we have not seen before. In contrast, the play of the police conforms to an old game. The gap between the arena of play and its analog arena is too minimal. To pretend to shoot is, in fact, to shoot. And so the tired old game is played out. The predictable, repetitive horror of state violence from which nothing is learned except the same old lesson of police impunity. The cop shoots, the singer is shot, he falls, continues to sing. He hits the ground, he is gone. But a moment later, he opens his eyes and smiles, his eyes full of knowing and friendship emanating from the other side. From fearlessness, his smile overflows and overstands death and rule. It is the purifying smile of spiritual love as an accomplished fact, irreducible, indestructible, indefatigable. What a marvel, seekers. A corpse ate death. If we think of this video as an essay receiving its light from the end, we see retrospectively that Kendrick Lamar was a ghost from the beginning, flying, floating, undead. I once heard Jalal Tawfiq give an incredible talk at Small Press Traffic in which he conjured the undead. He screened clips from old movies, classical musicals, and over the course of his talk, the dancing figures in the films could be perceived not as once filmed living people, nor as dead film stars, but rather as the living dead. But they were the unknowing undead. In Kendrick Lamar's video, when he and his character smiles after being shot, he shows undead as knowing. He shows living so near to death. Neither truth nor delusion, neither thinking nor its opposite. This is thinking as gesture. To undo state violence, to outdo being undone, to surpass gravity and death. So that is from an excerpt from that dialogue. And I'm going to read actually one more thing to bring us right up to the present. That was from 2016. And I wanted to read a kind of a piece that is a bit of a record of my pandemic year, in which also my father was very ill, and I've been doing caregiving in addition to all the other things we've all been doing. The piece is called Equinox. I complimented my father for handling his own illness so calmly. He demurred. I said, I hope you're not being too stoic. He said, what choice is there? To learn to die is to be your own topic, to see yourself from a distance, taxidermy coyote standing on paper planes high above a woodcut of sea-washed trees. You become an artwork, my last day, etched in foil onto a bright black page. My breath has a subtle taste. It tastes of the mouth, the clarity of teeth, the wet, malleable mouth, how it carries on, endless with vernacular, shapeless and helpless in sleep. I visited an artist in her studio, and she told me that beneath every painting there were hundreds of paintings. I paint and paint, make paintings which are loose ends, layered cold and darkness with light and lobes in limbo, slow floating coils and curving paths. Am I painting my own sense of downturn, the way my body lists to the left? It's the beginning of 2019 and then of 2020 and then of 2021, 2022 still in question. We follow each other around in circles. A year arrives, a bang, and it goes off. It freezes, it burns. My coat hangs on a hook. My hat, a broom by the door, rubber boots. A bomb goes off and my mind turns into a rose. My skin is flickered in rainbows. The blue peeks through the thin ends of young trees. Light glances, secretes the understory. Soil, mushrooms, moss, all these growing over and under each other, and the sun radiates the overstory, a pretty name, canopy. I saw Shaw yesterday, and we walked to the sea where the tide had gone out. We talked about work and drank wine. In her face, frustration, almost anguish. I feel milked, she said. The milking never ends. We sit in reedy grasses looking out at the hills and the sandy dark mounds of the withdrawn sound. The day and its qualities boundless, hundreds of birds swooping through their town of trees. I wake up hearing the word disorder in my ear. There are distances between the turbulence of the senses and the skin-enveloped image in the mirror. They say the mirror lies, but no more than any effect, mistaken for a cause. Notice how you are trying to act, then notice if anything else is happening, and if it is, step into it. So says Arwen, whose letter I'm reading on the plane from Seattle to San Francisco on Valentine's Day, 2020, miserably sick, but in no way seriously, on the way to see my in no way miserable, yet far more seriously sick father, but neither of us are sick with it. The big problem is stepping out of your old identity and into the dreaming process, stopping the world, so to speak, Arwen writes. To step out of my old identity, she thinks, I need to stop the world. Little did anyone suspect the world was about to step out of its old identity. The virus was then still a distant feeling, a ripple in the air. 2 people had been treated for it in the hospital where I spent the weekend with my father. Family visited us in the ER. One cousin wore a scarf around his mouth. My father lay curled and thin on the hospital bed. It's Saturday afternoon. Do you want to visit a cathedral or go to a garage sale? Well, these are not options. Anyway, I need to go to Walgreens to get my father's medications, and I roll down the street with the detritus. Because of the shortage, people have made masks and set them out for the taking, my first cloth mask of the year. When machines malfunction, gleaners have a field day, remarks Agnes Varda and the Gleaners and I. The cathedral guards the secrets of life. Alejandro Jodorowsky writes, God is a worker, of course, a builder, a carpenter, a stonemason. The principle of Shekinah exerts and regenerates itself constantly, in motion ceaselessly, the famous feedback loop, the difference that makes a difference, a recursive movement. When I read Winnicott's theory of the false self, I thought, how true. When I read Du Bois on double consciousness, I thought, consciousness times itself. The difference between a false self and double consciousness, whether or not you know why you are pretending. I woke up this morning and heard a sound, and for a moment I couldn't tell if it was my breathing or the wind in the trees. I couldn't tell the difference at all. When I was a child, my grandmother told me not to keep plants near my bed because they would take away some of the air. She also told me not to put my finger in my belly button, though I did both of these things. She didn't seem to understand how a lot of things worked, at least not in English. She had opinions built on things misheard, misread, as when we go our whole life singing the wrong lyrics to a song we don't realize we don't know, but who could blame her? Her fragmented lore is a natural effect of her fractured life as a child refugee. Her families and languages split apart, while she really came alive in laughter and crying, all her intelligence in love and feeling, a genius at grieving and hugging. No one loved us more viscerally. But as for her father's theology, she chose atheism. If the refugee finds refuge, they can come back to life. This image that we looked at, which mapped the election, who voted for whom, it's of a red strip from North Dakota to Texas. Real Americans, the strip reprimands. The unreal are deemed never to have entered this national reality, thought always to be just trying to get in, standing by the wrong door, awkward with archaic taped luggage and tormented by lack of rest. Are you real or unreal when you have no choice but to stay where you are? Or when you have no choice but to leave? Or when you never can shake the question, where am I? This reminds me of Kojin Karatani's explication of isonomia in ancient Ionia. To be free was then, above all, to be free to leave, to migrate, to exit. That was the definition of freedom. I remember running away from home as a child. I ran about 5 blocks and then went back home. Nobody noticed. Sometimes when you've shown yourself you can run away, you can just walk back. You walk back to where you're loved, to where you're needed. Maybe on your journey around the bend or over the rainbow, you find something to bring back. On that day, I brought back a question. What if you run away and no one notices? In one telling, the answer is, you discover solitude. Today, the length of the day is equal to the length of the night, equinox. My father is having a good day, and so for us, it is like a holiday. A projection occurs every time something inside of you finds an outer object to hang itself upon, so says Arwen. Z says, a projection is another way of crossing someone's boundaries. Projections are like that deer that jumped through a hair salon window in Long Island. Your emotions are that deer. Some are able to project into the world with so much force that it is shattering. I sit here at the table and take the measure of my projections, probe them, try to see where they come from or are going to, or where they went. I need to define them in their particularity, as well as generally ask, what do I mean by projection? What I mean is, it's not your problem, it's mine. A word with Latin and Greek origins from problema, headland, promontory, thing put forward, from pro, forward, and balein, to throw, projection, problem, things thrown. A problem is always intimately temporal. No problem is not a problem of time and therefore of purpose. There are problems that come from in front, pressing you back. These problems force you to think ahead. There are problems that come from behind, pushing you forward. These problems force you to think ahead. A problem comes from the future and the past. It comes from above and below and behind. It comes from all directions. It is both on its way and already here. Every problem that is not already manifested as an event, that is encroaching but conceivable to forestall, has this duality. If a problem is from the past and as of yet unsolved, a problem with a long half-life, a problem that remains a problem for generations, this means that the usual methods of problem solving from the past will not work, as evidently they have not worked, or the problem would not remain. I don't know whether gravity waves can be detected pulsing through the opaque red frequency of plasma that constitutes the outermost rim of the knowable universe beyond galaxies and what cosmologists call the dark ages, which are in the past yet come before, spatially speaking, the plasma beyond which we cannot see. There are other ways to detect things besides by means of vision, and thus the aforementioned gravity waves. Only when the problem comes to an end, only then can it be said that the future has arrived, when the problem becomes a memory, a story. Only problems that have become stories can be called the past, the great crumbling, dissolving, falling past. When problems have turned into stories told to future generations, as in once upon a time. If, on the other hand, a problem beckons from the future in the form of signs and auguries, the problem can only be solved by reading those signs and auguries accurately and acting accordingly. One must determine the ratio of thought to action for a given problem. There are problems that are solved with thought and problems that are solved with action. Some would say thinking is an action. There are, of course, thoughts that cause events. Perhaps all thoughts are events, as ceaseless and countless as teeming anthills, thoughts projected, thought projects, but there's only so much thought can do by itself. Okay, I'll stop there. It's 12:30, and I thank you for your attention and want to open the floor to questions and conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Miranda, for that wide variety of material. We have a couple of different ways of doing questions this afternoon. We have about a half hour remaining, and so I would invite all of you, if you have questions or comments, to find a way to bring them to us. The first way I can draw your attention to is through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A button that you can click, and you can type in a question, and then one of us will be able to read it out, and Miranda can engage that way. There's also a raise hand function. You'll see a button there at the bottom, and that would allow you to speak your question, and we could hear it in your own voice. So if you're interested in posing a question in your own voice, we invite that as well. And so keep those questions coming in. I see a couple have popped up already, and I'll see whether Sophia has a question to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Miranda. It was, as Eirik said, just so lovely to get such a wide spread of your work. And I guess in turning off of that, a lot of what we heard is poetry. And I'm curious about how poetry is feeling particularly suited to your work or problems or hypotheses right now, or in this work. And maybe more granularly, I'm wondering about how you relate to the line break versus the paragraph. And I thought about this because I find that your prose and poetry doesn't have such a hard barrier between it as a listener in particular. But I know that your poetry often has quite short lines, and so I think as a reader on the page, I feel more distinctions, but when you're reading, there's such a organic back and forth, I feel like. And so I don't, yeah, if you could just say a little bit about that.
Thanks, Sophia. Yeah, sometimes when this two problems in three parts really began as a novel, drafting and writing, and as I was working with it, to respond to your question as a kind of craft question, I realized that it would be useful for me to take the many pages of prose that are concerned with a particular plot or thread of the story, which has to do with this house that's falling down a ravine or about to fall down a ravine, and to rewrite all those pages in verse form, in a kind of metric, in order for me to sort of magnify at the level of the sentence and word and rhythm. And so this obviously slows things down a lot when you work this way, but I write slowly. And when I did that, it really helped me to understand the piece better. And I also, I found a kind of rhythm going on in that narrator's consciousness that it wasn't evident to me when it was in prose fiction paragraphs. So it is fiction, but it's fiction in a verse form. So that's one response. The line breaks feel like, just as a sentence can be described as a thought, I think enjammed lines can be expressive of a way of thinking, or a way of thinking, feeling. Yeah. So in a way, I started out as a child and a young person only ever writing poetry. And for the longest time, that was all I did. And then for a period of something like 15 years, I really only wrote fiction and essays. And now I think I'm sort of returning to what's there with the capaciousness of the poem of verse. Yeah, with what we, how much it can hold, from storytelling to elusive opacities and so on. But I think maybe it's worth noting, since there are so many writers with us today, that this move to that formal choice came not as a kind of decision to write in that form or genre, but rather as a technical decision to try to make my work more visible to myself, to make the piece more visible by arranging it differently. And I think that's really useful, to kind of rearrange and translate from form and mode to another form and mode, to get clearer about what the ideas are, and to tighten the weave of sections and so forth. So it's very much still in progress, and I'm sort of in this place with it where the final part, which is the fictive part, departs so much from this kind of very local first person narrator, just trying to figure out the landscape and the house and sort of the eco-poetics of that, to this kind of science fiction that is broader and is about a kind of transformative series of events. So I'm sort of moving between those modes right now. Yeah. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.
We've got some wonderful questions rolling in through the Q&A function, and we have at least one person who wants to voice a question. So we'll do one of the questions that are here in the Q&A. And Miranda, you can read them as well. You can click that Q&A button, and I'll pick one of these to read out, and then we'll go, after Miranda's answered that one, to our first spoken question, to our first voiced question. So here's a question from Mariah. Thank you so much for sharing, Miranda. Something that's particularly striking to me is how much work you have to draw from and the wide array of connections and constellations you draw in your writing. Can you speak a little to your processes, both of generating and of gathering such a wide array of ideas or texts?
Yeah, thank you, Mariah. I'll specifically talk about demystifications, because demystifications is really a tissue of quotations, sort of aphorisms, poems, anecdotes, little narratives, documentations, fragmented pieces of conversation, but woven throughout in a sort of organizing way are quotations. And I think of this particular book, which is definitely what you're describing, as building upon and the commonplace book. You know, it is not strictly a commonplace book because it is not only made of quotations, but it is working with that modality. And in a way, every text has an index, hidden or not. And in this case, the index is sort of on the surface, and Katie Eimar's index sort of surfaces it even more. It's very indexical, this text. And so it is a record in that sense of what I was reading when I wrote it, when I sort of happened upon this notion of a demystification, which I'm not sort of claiming is the action of the book, but I had this sense of it, of sensing into, feeling my way into a very particular species of the genus demystification that I became kind of very attuned to when that action seemed to be happening from something I overheard or something I read or something that occurred to me. And so I just sort of started writing. I sort of had in my mind this sensation of demystification. It was sort of as if you're on the beach and there's a certain kind of sand, you're only picking up the sand dollars, or you're out in the forest and you're only picking up certain kinds of rocks. It was like that. There's a specific thing that I'm sort of always, writing down and keeping track of. And so it's sort of a record in that way of this gesture. And that includes a record of what I was reading. And so it very much is a constellation that sort of points constantly out to other texts. Yeah. And then I think, I guess, I think that my poetic or philosophical practice is always including close reading and kind of commentary and working in that mode where reading and writing are together. They're really one thing. Yeah, I hope that answers Mariah's question. It will be familiar to everyone who's been in the classroom with me, this practice.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, Miranda, for the response. Well, why don't we jump to another short question in the Q&A. Cooper asks, where do you find most of your inspiration?
That is such a great question. Thank you, Cooper. I would say from reading, and from thinking. from conversation, from memory, and lately more and more and more and more and more from ecosystems, particularly forest ecosystems. That is relatively recent. Feels like there is a lot of dialogue happening in that arena. Yeah. A different kind of reading, different kind of conversing, different kind of listening, nonverbal. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the question, Cooper, and for the response, Miranda.
Thank you so much, RD. And thank you for your prayers.
Thank you for that give back, Artie. Really, really wonderful to hear. To hear your experience. Let's take a question from Lucian that's in the chat. And we've got about 15 minutes yet. So if you've got more questions, either to type or to voice, please bring them. So Lucian says, thank you, Miranda. I'm wondering if you can talk more about this idea of to be free is to be able to exit. To be free is to be able to exit. And also how essay and character are related in your writing.
Thank you, Lucian. So that was from that piece, Equinox, where I made reference, constellated, to Karatani's book. See if I can find the exact moment here, where he speaks about isonomia. And what he explicates there is that the very definition of freedom, as I wrote here, paraphrasing in for the Ionians, was the ability to leave, the ability to leave, and I have elsewhere in this text Elaine Scarry, who talks about nuclear weapons and how they foreclose our freedom to exit. For her, as long as there's nuclear deterrence, this is a bit grim, but for her, as long as that exists, no one is really free because no one has the choice to exit that, that logic. And the other part of Lucian's question was also how essay and character are related. Yeah. I would say that, for example, with the narrator of Two Problems, there's the possibility of essaying while kind of meditating on the situation, and of, if I'm kind of writing an essay, which I do sometimes, write and publish essays, writing as myself, where you know, there's no sense that there's characterization happening per se. That creates certain limits, which I appreciate and respect. And I think that there are essays in some sense that, or there is essaying, just to say there is attempting, that is better done by characters. If that, yeah, I think there are times when I realize that a set of things are emerging for me to think about or work on, and it is easier for me to kind of control or work with or unfurl those things if I sort of hand them to a character or a narrator. It maybe allows for some distancing. There's this kind of medium of the fictive that allows for a different kind of shaping that I find really generative. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thanks for the great question. And we've got actually two questions here that seem like they might go together. So the question from Georgie and the question from Shaw. They're slightly different, but I think there might be enough of a relation for us to pull them together. Georgie offers the following. When you are working on a braided essay or a piece that wanders, how do you keep track of your thought flow and the point you are working towards? By which I mean, is there a structure or a form you tend to lean towards? Georgie then puts in parentheses, when I write, I tend to circle. And the question continues, is there a thought shape you relate to when working on complex pieces? So that's the first question. We've got a question from Shaw. How do you visualize a central tone, guiding feeling that keeps you on track, but does not insist on narrative or theme? Two different questions, but I think they might resonate.
Yeah, I think they do. They feel related. They're wonderful, wonderful questions. So with Georgie's question, I think there's an implication that we're talking about long pieces. But maybe not. But I think that when Georgie writes a piece that wanders, and how do you keep track of your thought flow and the point you're working towards? Is there a structure or form you tend to lean towards? When I write, I tend to circle. Is there a thought shape you relate to when working on complex pieces? And then Shaw says, a central tone, guiding feeling. I feel as if Shaw's question is the answer to Georgie's question. Visualization or structure or form certainly come into play and are useful, but I think that this notion of a guiding feeling that keeps you on track, or guiding, maybe I would say, question, is the way that I'm tracking. I mean, I love that you use this word track, Georgie, because I think that there is something about tracking. And so as I mentioned with Demystifications, I've had this image of like, what was the organizing principle, or what was the methodology? And it really does feel like it's this basket metaphor, and maybe that's a shape, you know. Ursula Le Guin has that amazing piece about, you know, the container or the basket as a literary form, and that resonates with me, because it feels as if when there's something one is focused on or thinking about, a set of questions or problems, and then that forms a kind of basket, and then you sort of notice when the things that are concerned with that are around in your mind or in the world or in conversation or in text, and you bring them into the basket. And then maybe you weave them into the basket and they become part of the basket, or you take them out of the basket and you make something else with them. I think that I also, this is maybe another piece of this shape question, that sometimes it's a matter for me, or this has been an operative metaphor for me for a long time, is like of taking everything that's in the basket or the bag and throwing it out, turning it over and spilling it out onto the table, the way you would empty a big handbag full of stuff that's just accumulated and then see what's there. And in that way, there's a playing, it's a collage, right? There's collaging is very central to how I work. For sure, the sense of freedom and permission that comes with collaging, but there's rigor to it as well, right? Not just anything goes with anything. And I think Shaw's question about keeping on track but not insisting on a narrative or theme has to do with a mode that connects with the kind of improvisational or experimental sensibility or modality, where one is listening for what's emerging. You have a question or you have a concern, but you are, for me, it's not a matter of, and I think this can be a great way to work, but it's never been the way that I've worked, which is to make a complete plan and know exactly, have a kind of template or something. There's a listening and paying attention to accidents and to emergence. Yeah, but I think I like that you're saying does not insist on a narrative or theme. I think it's sort of as if the themes and narratives, they insist. I don't insist. They have their own insistence. It's sort of like this notion of recurring dreams. If you keep having the same dream over and over again, maybe it's asking something of you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for those questions and for the response.
Ivy asked, how do you go about encouraging editing and polishing these pieces where different themes and images flow together so fluidly? And I thought I'd pluck out this question because it relates to Georgie and Shaw. Ivy says it gives the impression of stream of consciousness refined with intent. And I think I just think that's a very eloquent and beautiful way of describing a writing process, a stream of consciousness, or I almost said unconsciousness, stream of unconsciousness refined with intent, because of course the unconscious is always there. And I think that answers your question, Ivy. You say, how do you go about encouraging editing and polishing these pieces where different themes and images flow together so fluidly? And then you say, it gives the impression of stream of consciousness refined with intent. And I don't think I can give a bit better answer than the one you've given. So thank you, everyone. It's really, thank you for listening and for being together today. I'm very, very deeply appreciative.
Thank you so much, Miranda. Thank you all for being here. As some of you might remember, previous art lectures have gone over by a few minutes, and I've said that we'll pay you back later in the quarter. That's what's happening right now. These 2 minutes that we have to spare are all yours. We look forward to seeing you at the Path parties this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you at the academic fair later this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you over the summer and next quarter, and fall quarter. And we look forward to starting the art lectures once again for their 11th year in fall of 2021. Bye-bye.